It was a humid summer evening in 1977 when Reverend Elijah Moore, known by many as simply Pastor Elijah, stepped out of his small church tucked at the edge of town. He had just finished a powerful Wednesday night service, one focused on healing, unity, and the enduring strength of faith. The congregation lingered longer than usual afterward, clapping him on the back, offering hugs, and chatting about Sunday's potluck. Pastor Elijah was the heart of the community, respected, admired, and loved by black and white residents alike, even in a town still wrestling with the deep roots of racial division. That night, he was the last to leave the church, locking up the old wooden doors by hand as he always did, humming a gospel hymn under his breath. His car, a faded blue Chevrolet with a dented bumper and a "God is Love" sticker on the rear window, sat quietly under a flickering street lamp. He waved goodbye to the church deacon across the street, calling out, "Tell Sister Jenkins I'll bring her casserole dish back Sunday." Then, with his worn leather Bible resting on the passenger seat, he pulled out of the gravel parking lot and drove off into the night. He was expected home by 9:30 p.m., just in time for a cup of tea and a few quiet moments with his wife, Lillian. But he never arrived. Hours passed. Lillian, calm at first, became uneasy, pacing their front porch barefoot, eyes scanning the dark country road. She called the church, then neighbors. No one had seen him since he drove off. Just before dawn, his car was found on a desolate stretch of road that cut through a thick pine forest. The engine was still warm. The driver's door was closed, keys still in the ignition, and his Bible was gone. But Pastor Elijah was nowhere in sight. It was as if the night had swallowed him whole. By sunrise, the quiet rural town was buzzing with unease. News of Reverend Elijah Moore's abandoned car spread quickly, moving from porch to porch, diner to barbershop. It didn't make sense. He was a creature of habit, dependable, thoughtful, never one to leave his wife or community waiting. Sheriff Dawson, a grizzled man who had known Elijah since childhood, arrived at the scene just after dawn. He stood silently for several minutes, staring at the old Chevrolet, its headlights dimmed and windshield fogged by morning dew. No signs of struggle. No footprints in the soft earth. No damage to the car. The door was unlocked, the seat adjusted just the way Elijah always kept it. It was eerie, too clean, too still. Search efforts began immediately. Dozens of locals joined the sheriff's department, fanning out in all directions from the spot where the car had been found. Men from the church brought bloodhounds from a nearby farm, while women prepared sandwiches and water for the searchers. Lillian Moore, quiet and composed despite the storm brewing inside her, insisted on helping, clutching her husband's scarf as she walked through brush and bramble. Volunteers combed the thick forest, checked nearby creeks, and called out Elijah's name until their voices were hoarse. The woods, usually a place of childhood adventure and Sunday picnics, felt sinister now, every rustle of leaves, every snapping twig hinting at a presence just out of reach. But hours passed, then days, and nothing. Not a torn piece of clothing, not a scuff in the dirt. It was as if he had simply evaporated. People began to whisper behind closed doors. Some thought he'd run off, maybe cracked under the pressure of shepherding a divided flock. Others feared he'd been taken, perhaps by someone who didn't like a black man preaching unity in a still fractured town. But there was no proof. The case lacked even the smallest clue. No ransom note, no sightings, no blood. Sheriff Dawson, frustrated and haunted, called in help from the state, and later the FBI, but the trail was already cold. The church held nightly vigils, filling pews with candles, hymns, and tears. Elijah's name echoed in every prayer, but the only answer was silence. As weeks stretched into months, the silence surrounding Reverend Elijah Moore's disappearance deepened into something heavier than grief, something shaped more like fear. His absence left a void not only in the hearts of his congregation but in the soul of the entire town. Whispers began to circulate in grocery store aisles, at gas stations, and in whispered phone calls after dark. People began to ask questions they had once been too polite, or too afraid, to voice. Why was there no trace at all? Who would want Elijah gone? And why did the sheriff's investigation seem to stall so quickly, as if the town was ready to forget a man they once claimed to admire? There were rumors, quiet but persistent, that Elijah had been getting threatening letters weeks before he vanished. Some said he had confronted a group of men at a town hall meeting, men known to have ties to an old, fading white supremacist network that still operated in the shadows. Elijah had always been bold, never afraid to speak truth in places where silence was safer. He had marched peacefully during the civil rights movement, preached about unity when others preferred the comfort of division, and had been working on a community outreach project that aimed to integrate a segregated housing district just months before his disappearance. In the minds of many, he had made enemies. Dangerous ones. A few townspeople remembered seeing strange cars parked near the church in the days before he vanished. Vehicles with out-of-state plates, unfamiliar faces behind the wheel. But none of the witnesses could provide solid descriptions, and the sheriff's department, either overwhelmed or unwilling, failed to follow up in any meaningful way. A handful of brave community members raised questions at town meetings, demanding a deeper investigation. But over time, their voices were drowned out by the uncomfortable silence of others who preferred to let the past stay buried. Without answers, theories bloomed like weeds. Some believed Elijah had simply walked away from everything, starting a new life elsewhere. Others believed something much darker, that he had uncovered something, perhaps a local conspiracy, perhaps a crime, and had paid for it with his life. But there was no closure. No evidence. No body. Only the growing certainty that something had gone terribly wrong and that someone, maybe many, knew more than they were willing to say. The mystery hardened into legend, passed down in quiet tones, especially to the younger generation who had only heard of Pastor Moore in stories. They spoke of him like a ghost, a man who stood up for justice, then vanished into the trees, never to be seen again. Years passed, and the town slowly returned to its routines, though the memory of Reverend Elijah Moore remained like a scar beneath the surface. His church, once filled with the hum of hymns and laughter of children, stood quieter now, its wooden pews worn smooth by time and sorrow. The congregation did its best to move forward, appointing a new pastor and continuing Sunday services, but something had changed. The warmth in the sanctuary felt dimmer, like a candle flickering against a cold wind. Lillian Moore, once the heart of every church gathering, began to withdraw. She still sat in her usual spot each week, hands folded in her lap, a soft handkerchief clutched tight, but her eyes seemed always fixed on the door, still hoping, after all those years, for Elijah to walk back through it. The community marked the anniversary of his disappearance quietly, with prayer. Circles and candlelight vigils. People placed flowers at the edge of the road where his car was found, now overgrown with wild grass and weeds. Children who had once known him as Pastor Eli had grown up and moved away, taking the story with them like a shadow cast behind them. The investigation remained unsolved, locked away in a dusty cabinet in the sheriff's office, the file thinned by time and forgetfulness. Still, the older residents hadn't forgotten. The hurt lingered, unspoken but deeply felt. Whenever talk of Elijah's disappearance crept into conversations, voices lowered, eyes shifted, and the past hovered like a fog no one could quite see through. Some believed justice would come someday, that God would not let such a thing stay hidden forever. Others had grown cynical, saying the truth was buried deeper than anyone dared to dig. A few tried to keep the memory alive more actively, like Elijah's niece, who became a civil rights attorney and spoke often of her uncle's legacy. She returned every year to the town where her family's story had changed forever, laying a single white lily on the church steps before quietly slipping away again. The town, though changed, still bore the weight of the mystery. The empty space Elijah left behind became part of its landscape, silent, solemn, and unresolved. No new clues had surfaced. No confessions had been made. But beneath the routine of ordinary life, the question remained, what really happened to Reverend Elijah Moore? It was a crisp autumn morning in 2002 when Hank Dillard, a seasoned logger who had worked the pine forests of the region for over 30 years, drove his truck deep into an area of woodland that hadn't been touched in decades. The forest had reclaimed the land over the years, swallowing old trails and hiding long-forgotten landmarks beneath layers of moss and fallen leaves. Hank, a quiet man known more for his chainsaw than conversation, had been contracted to clear a few acres for a new road project. The work was routine, the kind of job he could do with his eyes half closed. But that morning, something didn't sit right. There was a stillness in the woods, a weight in the air that made the hair on the back of his neck prickle. As he worked his way through the dense underbrush, Hank came across a large, decaying tree stump, oddly hollow at the base. It was jagged and rotted, partially caved in, as if nature had been trying for years to reveal what was hidden inside. Curiosity got the better of him. He stepped closer, brushing aside the thick vines and dirt that clung to the stump like secrets. When he peered inside, he froze. Nestled within the hollow cavity, surrounded by layers of crumbled bark and years of decomposed forest floor, were what appeared to be human remains. Bones, mostly intact, lay curled in an unnatural position. At first, he thought it might be the remains of a hunter or hiker long lost in the woods. But then he saw something that made his breath catch. Resting near the skeleton was a rusted cross necklace, still faintly gleaming in the soft morning light. Beside it, wedged between brittle ribs, was a weather-worn Bible with pages stuck together by time and moisture. On the inside cover, barely legible, was a name scrawled in faded ink, Elijah Moore. Hank stumbled back, heart pounding, unsure whether to scream or pray. His hands shook as he dialed the sheriff's office on his old flip phone. Within hours, the forest was swarming with investigators, crime scene tape wrapped around the trees like warning ribbons from the past. For 25 years, Reverend Moore had been missing, his story reduced to whispers and memories. Now, after all this time, he had finally been found, not buried in a graveyard, not lost in some distant place, but hidden in plain sight, buried beneath a tree as if the earth itself had been keeping his secret. As forensic teams moved carefully around the ancient stump, the quiet woods were filled with the low hum of voices, the snapping of photographs, and the soft brushing of dirt from bone. The skeletal remains were remarkably preserved for having been buried for over 2 decades. The damp, protected cavity of the stump had acted like a tomb. Beside the remains, they catalogued the rusted necklace, its cross symbol still unmistakable despite years of decay, and the mold-speckled Bible with its warped leather cover. But it was the other item, a small brass pocket watch, that sent chills down the spine of even the most seasoned detectives. The watch was cracked and stained, its glass face shattered, but its hands were frozen in time, at precisely 9:17 p.m. Investigators immediately noted the detail, suspecting it may have been the exact moment Reverend Moore died. The timestamp aligned eerily with the last known sighting of him the night he disappeared. They also found scraps of old fabric nearby, possibly remnants of his jacket or clerical collar, and what looked like strands of barbed wire, coiled and buried deeper in the soil, suggesting he may have been bound or restrained before death. It was becoming clear that this was not a case of a man who simply wandered off and died by accident. This had been a secret grave, a hidden execution. Forensic anthropologists later confirmed that the cause of death was blunt force trauma to the skull. Reverend Moore had been struck hard, likely more than once. The bones showed signs of defensive wounds. He had fought back. They couldn't tell exactly how long he had remained alive after the attack, but the positioning of the body and the objects around him suggested he had either been dragged to the location or forced to walk into the woods before being killed and hidden beneath the roots of the young tree that had since grown into a towering stump. The discovery shook the town to its core. People gathered outside the church with candles and tearful prayers, holding onto each other as they tried to process the truth they had feared but never fully confronted. For Lillian Moore, now a frail, silver-haired widow living alone, the confirmation was a blow and a blessing. Her years of wondering were over. Elijah hadn't run away. He hadn't given up. He had been taken, silenced, and someone had gone to great lengths to make sure he would never be found. As investigators packed the remains and artifacts into evidence containers, a storm rolled in over the forest. Rain began to fall gently on the crime scene, washing away loose soil and settling the air. The truth, once buried for a generation, had finally surfaced. But the hardest questions still remained: who had done this, and why had it taken so long for the town to see it? With Reverend Elijah Moore's remains now officially identified, the sheriff's department, under new leadership from a younger, reform-minded sheriff named Cole Harmon, reopened the investigation as a homicide. The discovery reignited emotions that had long been buried in the town, stirring up memories and resentments that had never truly gone away. Sheriff Harmon, only a child when Elijah vanished, had grown up hearing the hushed stories, the conflicting rumors, and the palpable silence surrounding the case. Now, standing at the center of a crime scene that had eluded investigators for 25 years, he made it his mission to uncover the truth. The forensic evidence, while aged, pointed to foul play with disturbing clarity. But it was old newspaper clippings, church records, and a series of anonymous letters found tucked inside the back of Elijah's Bible that began to piece the story together. The letters, dated just weeks before his disappearance, contained warnings, handwritten notes urging Elijah to stop asking questions and leave things buried. There was no signature, but investigators noticed a distinct ink and writing style. It matched a former town official, now deceased, who had long been rumored to have ties with a local chapter of a white supremacist group that operated in the region in the 1960s and 70s. Digging deeper, Sheriff Harmon uncovered old FBI surveillance files from the civil rights era that confirmed the presence of the group, which had been linked to threats, arson, and intimidation in several surrounding counties. Elijah, it turned out, had been quietly investigating a corrupt land deal that involved several powerful men in town, men who stood to profit from pushing black families out of a particular neighborhood. His sermons in the weeks leading up to his disappearance had grown bolder, more pointed. He had begun naming injustices. He was getting too close to something dangerous. The new evidence painted a chilling picture. Elijah hadn't just disappeared. He had been targeted, silenced by men who feared what he stood for. Sheriff Harmon interviewed elderly residents who had once been members of the sheriff's posse, former churchgoers, and relatives of now deceased suspects. Many were reluctant to speak, weighed down by guilt, fear, or shame. But a few came forward, now in their 70s and 80s, ready to finally tell the truth. One man, trembling in a hospital bed, confessed that Elijah had been lured out to the woods that night under the pretense of meeting someone who had promised to deliver proof of corruption. Instead, he was ambushed. The confession, while powerful, came too late for prosecution. Most of those involved were either dead or unfit for trial. But it was enough to complete the picture. Reverend Elijah Moore had been martyred for his convictions, buried in silence, and nearly forgotten. Now, at last, the full truth was surfacing, and it demanded to be acknowledged. The town could no longer pretend that his disappearance had been a mystery, it had been a crime. One rooted in hate, fear, and a desperate attempt to stop a man who stood firmly on the side of justice. The town held a memorial unlike any it had seen before. It was not just a funeral, it was a reckoning. A full 25 years after his disappearance, Reverend Elijah Moore was finally laid to rest, this time with dignity, truth, and the full weight of his story acknowledged. The small church he once pastored overflowed with people, those who had known him, those who had grown up hearing his name whispered in reverence or sorrow, and those who had once been too afraid to speak now standing in the light of belated justice. The air was thick with emotion as gospel music filled the sanctuary, the same hymns Elijah had led so many years ago now rising with a raw, healing energy. Lillian Moore, now in a wheelchair, sat front and center. Though frail, her eyes held a deep strength as she watched the wooden casket, draped in white cloth and adorned with lilies, brought down the aisle. Beside her stood her niece, now an attorney and activist, who had fought to keep Elijah's case alive when others gave up. She would later speak with quiet intensity about legacy, about unfinished work, and about a town finally forced to confront its shadows. As the service unfolded, people began to stand and share memories, stories of how Elijah had helped them through grief, how he had marched beside them in protest, how he had spoken hard truths from the pulpit when it would have been easier to stay silent. His courage had not only changed lives, it had scared the powerful. The new sheriff spoke too, not just as law enforcement, but as a son of the town acknowledging past failures. "We failed him once," he said, "but we honor him now. And we remember." After the service, a procession of cars followed the hearse through town, past the old church, the high school, and the tree-lined road where Elijah's car had been found all those years ago. At the cemetery, his grave was dug beside a towering oak, its limbs outstretched like arms in prayer. As the final words were spoken and the casket lowered into the earth, the sky above, overcast all morning, broke open just enough to let a shaft of sunlight fall directly on the grave. Later, a memorial plaque was placed outside the church, etched with his name, his favorite scripture, and the words, "He stood for truth. He walked with courage. He rests in peace." The story of Elijah Moore would no longer be buried in rumor and silence. It would be taught in schools, shared from the pulpit, and remembered at town gatherings, not as a tragedy but as a testament. His death had once been a secret. Now, it was a symbol, a call to vigilance, to justice, and to never let silence bury the truth again.